The ship was white. That was the first thing anyone noticed about the UNHS Asclepius. Not her size, though she was large enough to swallow a city block whole. Not her engines, though they hummed at a frequency that made the bones of smaller ships feel nervous. Not her crew, though they were 847 strong and came from 31 countries and spoke 62 languages between them. The white. She was painted white from bow to stern, interrupted only by the red cross on her hull, a symbol so old that most humans had forgotten the wars that made it necessary. The cross was 40 meters wide. You could see it from 3,000 kilometers out. That was the point. That had always been the point. You could see it and you would know. You would know what the ship was and what it was not. You would know what lived inside her and what didn't. What lived inside her? 2,400 patients, 11 species, wounds ranging from standard plasma burns to 3 types of injury that human medicine had no formal name for yet, cataloged in crew notes as the purple one, the thing with the fluid, and please ask Dr. Yemi. What did not live inside her? Weapons? Not one. Not a single gun, not a rail, not a torpedo tube, not even the kind of small defensive systems that most civilian ships carried as a matter of common sense. The Asclepius had been stripped of all of it before her first mission, and the space had been filled with surgical bays instead. This was not an accident. This was a statement. This ship will not fight you. This ship will only heal. She had been broadcasting the Mercy Covenant signal for 6 months without pause. A tone, a frequency, a language that every species in the galactic conclave had agreed on 40 centuries before humanity had figured out that the Earth went around the sun. The signal meant hospital. The signal meant protected. The signal meant even if we are at war, this ship exists outside of war. The Asclepius was 6 months into her run through the Kethvar corridor. The corridor was ugly. 3 different wars had been chewing through it for 11 years, none of them involving humans, all of them producing casualties that had nowhere to go. Worlds without functional hospitals, ships full of wounded with no place to land. The wars were about territory and resources and ancient insults, the way most wars are, and none of the species fighting them had thought to stop fighting long enough to collect their injured. So humanity had done it. The Asclepius collected them. She moved through contested space like a ghost, and nobody shot at her because nobody shot at hospital ships. That was the rule. That had been the rule for 4,000 years. It was older than most of the species currently sitting at the conclave table. It was the one thing everyone agreed on without argument, without negotiation, without fine print. Dr. Amara Solis was elbow deep in a Keth patient's secondary thorax when the proximity alarm sounded. She didn't look up. Proximity alarms on the Asclepius were common. Space was full of debris in the corridor, pieces of ships, discarded equipment, occasionally, embarrassingly, bodies. You checked, you logged, you moved on. "Hey, what is it?" she asked without looking. The nurse across the table, a young man named Piotr, who had been on the Asclepius for 8 months and still went wide-eyed at things, checked the panel on the wall. "Voth ship," he said. 3 of them. "Heading?" Piotr looked at the panel for a moment too long. "Amara," he said. She looked up. His face told her before he said it. "They're heading for us." She looked back down at her patient. The Keth's secondary thorax needed another 12 minutes of work, minimum. She had been a surgeon for 19 years. She had operated through turbulence, through power fluctuations, through a period where the ship's oxygen system had hiccuped for 40 seconds, and everyone in the bay had breathed a little harder and said nothing. She kept her hands steady. "Get me the bridge," she said. On the bridge gave her Captain Dara Reeves, 53 years old, 20 years in the UN medical fleet, a woman who had sailed the Asclepius through 2 active battle zones without a scratch on her paint. "Tell me they're passing through," Solis said. "They're not passing through," Reeves said. Her voice was flat, not calm. Flat was different from calm. Flat was what happened when calm was no longer available and something harder had to fill the space. "We're broadcasting the Covenant signal?" "Have been for 6 months. Yes. And they know, Amara." Silence. The hum of the ship. Somewhere in the corridor outside the surgical bay, a Nuon patient was clicking rhythmically, which the crew had learned meant pain. and a human nurse was clicking back in approximate imitation, which Dr. Yemi had learned helped. What do we do?" Piotr asked. Neither of the women answered him, because the answer was nothing. There was nothing to do. The Asclepius had no weapons. She had no speed to outrun both pursuit craft. She had no shields worth mentioning, because shields were considered armament under the Covenant, and the Asclepius had surrendered all of it. She had her white paint. She had her signal. She had the 4,000-year-old agreement of every civilized species in the galaxy. And across 800 kilometers of empty space, a Voth admiral named Kreth Savrun sat in her command chair and did the math. Kreth Savrun had 6 arms. 2 of them were currently folded across her chest in the posture her species used when thinking through a calculation. They were fairly certain was correct but wanted to verify. When the Asclepius was carrying wounded from the Soon Collective and the Keth Coalition. Both were species the Voth were currently in negotiations with. Hostile negotiations, the kind where everyone smiled and nothing was agreed to. Both negotiations had reached what Kreth Savrun considered a frustrating impasse. She needed leverage. The Asclepius had 1,553 non-human patients on board. Leverage, in other words. Leverage with life support requirements and medical dependencies and families who would absolutely pressure their governments if they understood the alternative. Kreth Savrun had run the calculation 4 times. The Mercy Covenant was 4,000 years old. Humans were 43 years into galactic contact. They were, by all accounts, naive, emotional, still learning how civilization worked at scale. And the conclave would protest. There would be formal censure. There would be a period of careful diplomacy, and she would have her leverage. She did not think about what happened after. She had run a calculation and liked the answer. That was all. She gave the order. The attack lasted 11 minutes. Solis knew this because she finished the surgery. She kept her hands in the Keith patient's secondary thorax, and she did not stop, and she counted her breaths, and she finished the surgery while the ship shook around her, while the lights went twice, while Piotr stopped clicking back at the noon patient in the corridor because there was no longer a corridor. 11 minutes. She finished. She closed. She stepped back. The surgical bay was intact. The section of the ship she was standing in was intact. That was the extent of the intact. She knew this because the ship had gone quiet in a way that ships should not go quiet. The hum was wrong. Everything was wrong. She stepped into the corridor, and the corridor ended. Not a wall, not a door. It ended. Open space where ship used to be. The stars were very clear and very bright and very close, and her suit's emergency seal activated before she could think about it, before she could finish the thought she was starting, and she grabbed the wall with both hands and did not look at the stars. She did not look at the stars. She looked at her hands on the wall. She counted to 10. She looked up. She was the only person she could see. The distress call went out at minute 8. It was brief. The Asclepius's communication systems were already failing by then, so brief was what was available. The call gave coordinates, a ship identification, Covenant signal frequency, and 3 words. We are unarmed, then nothing. The call was received by 11 vessels in the sector, 2 of which were Voth, 5 of which were non-aligned, and 4 of which were ships from Conclave member species. It was also received on a 6-second delay by Earth's relay station at the edge of the Kethvar corridor. The relay station flagged it automatically, queued it, and transmitted it to the UN Medical Fleet Command Center in Geneva. It arrived at 3:14 in the morning, Geneva time. The duty officer on shift was a man named Sergeant Paulo Ferreira, who had been awake for 6 hours and was on his 4th coffee. He received the distress flag, cross-referenced it with the Asclepius's last registered position, and followed protocol, which meant he woke his supervisor, Ikra, who woke her supervisor, who woke the director of fleet operations, who called the UN Secretary General, who sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and listened to 3 words. We are unarmed, then nothing. By then it was 4:47 in the morning. By then the Asclepius had been silent for 93 minutes. By then Solis was the one who found the life pods. 4 of them. Functional. She got 31 people into them before the secondary systems failed. 31 out of the 847 crew and 2,400 patients. She did not have time to think about this number. She did not have the space for it. She sealed the last pod and went back for more people, and there were no more people. She did not go back to the pod. She sat on the floor of what remained of Cargo Bay 7 in a suit that would hold atmosphere for another 9 hours. And when she looked at her hands, they were still steady. She noticed that and did not know what to do with it. The news moved through the galactic conclave the way a fire moves through dry grass. By midday on Earth, every species with a seat at the conclave table knew. The Asclepius, the Covenant frequency, the 11 minutes, 3,248 dead, 847 human crew, 1,553 patients from 11 species, and the 31 survivors in the life pods, because 3 of the 4 pods had been struck by debris before rescue vessels reached them. The math left 28 survivors out of 3,276 people. The conclave reacted the way civilized species react to atrocity. There were emergency sessions. There were broadcast condemnations from 14 species. The Soon Collective, Wine, whose wounded had been on the Asclepius, publicly severed their negotiation talks with the Voth hegemony. 3 conclave members called for Kreth-Savroon's immediate arrest and trial. The Noon species, whose patients had made up the largest non-human group on board, went into formal mourning, a 9-day observance that included a complete communications blackout, which in practice meant they weren't answering anyone's calls for a week. The conclave sent a formal message to Earth: condolences, support, a commitment to justice through proper channels. Earth did not respond. This was noticed. This was strange. Humanity's diplomatic offices were known for prompt communication. It was considered one of their more charming traits, the eagerness, the constant talking. And silence from Earth was anomalous in the way that silence from a very loud dog is anomalous. You notice it before you understand why it's worrying. The conclave sent a follow-up message. Earth did not respond. 48 hours after the attack, a conclave monitoring station near the Mars relay picked up unusual energy signatures from the Sol system. It flagged them as anomalous and sent the data to the analysis team. The analysis team looked at the signatures and sent them to a senior analyst named Dr. Priya Mehta, who had spent 11 years studying human civilization on behalf of the Conclave's Cultural Continuity Department. She had 3 published papers on human psychology. She had spent 8 months living in New Delhi on research exchange. She had eaten something called a chat at a street stall and had thought about it ever since. She looked at the energy signatures. She sat very still for a moment. Then she pulled up her notes, 11 years of them, handwritten in a hybrid of 3 languages the way she thought in, dense with observations and references and underlined passages. She found the entry she was looking for. She had written it 3 years ago, after a series of interviews with human veterans of various conflicts. She had been trying to understand something that kept coming up in human accounts of war, something that didn't map cleanly onto any other species' accounts, something that other civilizations had no direct equivalent for. She had called it, tentatively, the grief threshold. The entry read, "Human beings do not distinguish between grief and motivation the way other species do. In most civilizations, grief is an ending, a period of cessation before life resumes. In human psychology, grief of sufficient magnitude does not end behavior. It redirects it, it becomes fuel. The human capacity for what they call purpose in loss, the transformation of mourning into directed action, appears to have no upper limit that I have been able to identify. Do not mistake human diplomacy for human nature. Diplomacy is what they do when they are choosing peace. Observe what they do when they stop choosing it." She had underlined this last part. She looked at the energy signatures again. Warships, human warships, coming online in numbers she had not imagined Earth possessed. The Sol system was not quiet in the way of a species in shock. It was quiet in the way of something loading. She pulled up her secure channel to the Conclave Council and began composing an urgent memo. She noted the time. 6:31 a.m., station local. She sent the memo at 6:47 a.m. She found out later that it arrived 4 hours after it became irrelevant. Solus was the one they put on the broadcast. She hadn't asked for it. She hadn't volunteered. She had been sitting in a hospital room on Luna Station for 6 days, going through what the medical staff called debriefing, and she called being stared at. They had checked her for injuries, for exposure, for psychological trauma markers. They had been thorough and kind, and she had answered every question in the same flat voice, and they had written things down. On day 6, a man came to her room. Young, suit that cost too much, UN insignia. He explained what they needed. She said no. He explained why it was important. She said no again. He left. An hour later, a woman came. Older, no suit, just a gray sweater, the kind of sweater that meant she hadn't slept either. She sat down and she didn't explain anything. She just sat. After a while, she said, I lost my daughter 3 years ago. Nothing like this. Car accident. Mundane and stupid and terrible. Solis looked at her. I know it's not the same, Asharin, the woman said. I'm not saying it's the same. Then what are you saying? I'm saying I know what it looks like when someone is deciding whether to speak. Solis looked at the window. Luna Station had a view of Earth from that wing of the hospital, a blue and white curve hanging in nothing. They'll use whatever I say, Solis said. Yes. To justify what they've already decided to do. Yes. I don't know if I want that. The woman was quiet. Then, do you know their names? Your crew? Solis closed her eyes. She knew every name. She had been going through them in the dark every night since she got here. Not because she was trying to, because they were there. Costa, Yemi, Piotr, Reeves, 843 others, and the faces that went with the names and the voices that went with the faces. All of them, she said. The woman nodded. She said nothing else. She sat for another few minutes, and then she got up and left. The next morning, Solis asked for a camera. She spoke for 4 minutes. She did not cry. She had not cried yet, and she was not going to start in front of a camera because that was not what this was. This was something else. Something that sat in the chest lower than grief, heavier than anger, older than both. She said their names. Not all 847. She didn't have 4 hours. She said 12 names. She chose them the way you choose anything when the choosing is impossible. Randomly, which meant she chose the ones she saw first when she closed her eyes. She said what they were doing. She said the word hospital 7 times. She said unarmed twice. She said Mercy Covenant once. She held up her badge, the UNHS badge with the Red Cross on it. She said, this is what we were wearing. This is what the ship was flying. This is what it meant. She paused. I want you to understand what we were doing when they came for us. We were healing people. We were healing their people. We were not soldiers. We were not threats. We were doctors and nurses and orderlies and cooks and engineers. We got up every morning and we went to work and we tried to help. Another pause. That's all we were doing. She put her badge down. The broadcast cut. It was translated into the languages of every conclave species within the hour. It was played on every major network on Earth within 6 minutes. By the time the conclave's translation matrix had finished processing it, the UN Security Council had already been in closed session for 4 hours. By the time the conclave's cultural analyst, Dr. Mehta, watched the broadcast and understood what Solis's steady hands meant, not shock, not dissociation, one but the hands of someone who had decided, the Security Council was already voting. The vote took 11 seconds. It was unanimous. It had never been unanimous before. It had never been unanimous about anything before. The stars outside the window of Luna Station's hospital room looked the same as they always had. Cold, bright, indifferent. They would not look the same much longer. The Security Council went dark at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. Not quiet. Dark. Every diplomatic channel Earth ran went to static. Every scheduled communication with the conclave, with member species, with allied stations, all of it stopped. The feeds went dead. The ambassadors stopped answering. The public messaging system for the UN went offline for the first time in 22 years. The galaxy noticed. And they noticed the way you notice when a neighbor who talks constantly stops talking mid-sentence. You turn around. You look. You wait for them to finish. Earth didn't finish. 6 hours of silence. 7, 12. The conclave's communication desk flagged it as a technical fault at R2. By hour 5, they had stopped calling it a fault and started calling it a concern. By hour 12, they had opened a special session of the council. Not about the Asclepius, That session had already been called, already been argued through, already produced 3 formal statements and a committee, but about the silence, about what the silence meant. Species who had been watching humans for 43 years offered opinions. The new one representative, still in their formal mourning colors for their own dead on the Asclepius, said humans grieved loudly and then stopped. The silence was the stopping. It would pass. The Soon Collective's delegate, a four-eyed being named Vastor, who had spent a decade as a cultural liaison on Earth, said nothing for a long time. When pressed, she said, "You are asking the wrong question." "What is the right question?" the council chair asked. "What are they doing during the silence?" Vastor said. "Not what the silence means. What is happening inside it?" Nobody had a good answer for that. Inside the silence, the Security Council was doing something it had never done. Agreeing. Every nation at the table. Every bloc. Interests that had been opposed since before the conclave first contact. Old borders and older grudges. The economic rivalries dressed up as policy. All of it sat in a pile in the corner of the room and nobody looked at it. The document on the table was short. It had been drafted in 3 hours by a committee of 12 people from 6 different nations, and it said very little in the way that very few things say very little and mean everything. It was not called a declaration of war. The conclave's translation matrix ran it through 17 linguistic frameworks trying to find an equivalent. The matrix was 4,000 years old and had been built to handle the most complex diplomatic language any civilized species had ever produced. It processed the human document for 9 minutes. It produced 3 words, then flagged those 3 words as inadequate. Tried again. The closest it could assemble, from pieces of 17 languages, was something that translated approximately as, "We are coming. We are not stopping. There is nothing you can offer us." This was the translation the conclave received. The council chamber went very quiet. Rear Admiral Yusra Okafor was in her office at Fleet Command when the vote came through. She had been a surgeon before she was an admiral. Hands-on, precise, the kind of doctor who finished surgeries that other surgeons started because she did not have the ability to leave things incomplete. She had traded surgery for command at 40, for reasons she did not explain to people who asked and explained very clearly to herself. She had been in command of the 7th Fleet for 6 years. In that time, she had run 3 active zone operations, 2 humanitarian deployments, and 1 situation that the official report called a complex intervention, and that the people who had been there called the worst 11 days of their lives. She had never lost a ship. She was looking at the Asclepius manifest when her aide knocked. The aide said, "Admiral, the vote." She said, "Oh, no, I know." She did not look up from the manifest. It was open on her screen. She had opened it 4 times in 6 days, and the number at the top, 847, had not changed and was not going to change, and she kept looking at it as though it might. "Orders from UNHQ, the aide said. "Put them on the secondary screen." The orders came up. She read them without moving her face. The manifest was still on the primary screen. The names were very small in standard text. She had been reading them in the dark at night since she heard. She knew them without looking. "When do we ship?" she asked. 72 hours for first wave. Full mobilization by week 3. She nodded. She closed the manifest. She opened it again. The aide understood. The aide left. The mobilization that followed was not impressive to the galaxy. That was the honest truth of it. Human warships were not the most advanced in the conclave. They were mid-range in firepower, mid-range in shielding, below average in range, and powered by a propulsion system that 3 conclave species had considered obsolete for 2 centuries. The galaxy had seen humanity's military capabilities assessed twice in formal conclave reviews. Both times the assessors had been polite. The second assessment had used the phrase developing potential, which was the diplomatic equivalent of not yet. The Voth hegemony received detailed intelligence on the mobilization within a week. Kretz Savrun reviewed it personally. Humans were moving ships, more ships than she had expected. That was a surprise, the sheer number. But still the same ships, the same technology. She gave it to her analysts, and her analysts gave her a timeline. 6 months for Earth's fleet to reach Voth space. 2 years for them to pose a meaningful threat. Plenty of time. She had her legal team draft a position paper on the Mercy Covenant. The position paper argued that the Asclepius had been in contested space, that the designation of medical neutrality was ambiguous in active war zones not involving the protecting party, and that a good faith misidentification could not be held to the same legal standard as a deliberate attack. The position paper was 37 pages. It was the best legal argument available. She sent it to the conclave with a cover letter expressing deep regret. The Voth sent the position paper to Earth on day 4. Earth didn't respond. They sent a follow-up on day 7. Earth didn't respond. Kreth Sovrun sent a personal message directly to the UN Secretary General on day 10. Formally worded, correct in every diplomatic protocol. It expressed sorrow for the tragic loss of life and proposed the establishment of a joint investigation committee to determine the full circumstances of the incident, overseen by neutral conclave observers. Earth didn't respond. On day 14, Earth stopped monitoring the diplomatic frequency entirely. An automated message played instead. This channel is currently unavailable. Please direct communications to the Galactic Conclave Mediation Office. The Conclave Mediation Office received approximately 400 communications from the Voth hegemony over the following month. They received 0 from Earth. Vastor of the Soon Collective watched all of this from her posting at Conclave Central Station and understood more than she wanted to. She had lived on Earth for a decade. She had sat in human kitchens and watched humans cook, and watched humans fight, and watched humans laugh, and watched humans grieve. And she had taken careful notes. More careful than her official reports. Notes she kept in a private file she had never shown the conclave. The private file had one section she had spent a long time on. She had titled it, in a human language she had learned to think in, "What They Don't Let Go." The section was about how humans related to their dead, not the rituals. She had documented those separately. They were well covered in official research. This was about something underneath the rituals, something that persisted. Most species mourned and then reorganized around the loss. They filled the space. They moved the furniture of their lives, and the dead person's absence became part of the new arrangement. Humans, Vostor had observed, did not always do this. Some deaths they did not fill, some deaths they carried. Not as weight. Weight implied burden, implied something they wished they could put down. More like material. Like a sculptor who had found a particular kind of stone and decided everything they built after would use it. She had not known what to do with this observation when she wrote it. She understood it now. She put in a request to speak to the Conclave Council. Full session. Priority flag. She got a slot in 3 days. She spent 2 days writing what she needed to say. On the morning of the 3rd day, she received news that Earth's first wave had departed Sol. She canceled the session. It was too late for what she had to say to matter. The ship that carried Okafor was called the Johannesburg. She had not named it. She had not asked for it. She had been given command of the full expeditionary force, and the Johannesburg was the flagship, and that was that. She stood on the bridge of the Johannesburg and watched Sol shrink behind them, and she did not feel the things she was supposed to feel in the moment. No fire, no clarity, no righteous certainty. She felt tired. She felt the specific tiredness of someone who has made a decision that cannot be unmade, and who is now on the other side of making it and has to live in the world that the decision creates. It was not doubt. She was not doubting. It was more like the feeling after you swallow something hard. The swallowing is done, but the weight of the thing is still with you. She went to her quarters and opened the manifest again. She did something she had not done yet. She read them aloud. All 847 names, one by one. She did not rush. She did not skip. She did not stop when her voice got strange on certain names. The ones she knew, the ones that attached themselves to faces and voices, and one very specific memory of Dr. Yemi explaining over terrible ship coffee that the noon-clicking communication system was actually similar in some ways to a human language he had learned as a child, and that he thought he might be able to hold a basic conversation if he practiced. She finished at 3 a.m. She sat with the silence for a while. Then she closed the manifest, closed her eyes, and slept 4 hours. In the morning, she was up before her crew. She did not open the manifest again. She did not need to. She had them now. All of them. They were not going anywhere. Alain Marchetti had been a diplomat for 30 years. He was 61, white-haired, and with the kind of face that had been good-looking once, and was now distinguished in the way that good-looking becomes distinguished when it has been through enough. He had mediated border disputes. He had talked two species out of a resource war that everybody had agreed was inevitable. He had, over 30 years, built a reputation as the man you sent when the situation was past saving, and you wanted someone to save it anyway. He was currently Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Conclave, or he had been. He was watching the mobilization feeds from his office at Conclave Central Station when the Soon Collective's senior delegate requested a meeting. He agreed. He knew what the meeting was about. He poured himself coffee and sat behind his desk, and the Soon delegate came in. A different one from Vostor. A more senior official whose name was Pelin Va, and who had 3 centuries of diplomatic experience, and who had negotiated the Soon's entry into the conclave before Marchetti's grandparents were born. Pelin Va sat. Pelin Va laid out an offer. It was a comprehensive offer. Marchetti listened to the whole thing. He was good at listening. It was the skill that had built his career, the ability to actually hear what people were saying and what they were not saying at the same time. The offer included Cressa of Rune's formal censure, her removal from command, her trial in front of a conclave tribunal. It included reparations, significant ones, real ones, not a diplomatic gesture, but actual resources directed to Earth and to the families of the dead. It included restructured protections for medical vessels. It included a formal apology from the Voth hegemony, recorded and broadcast on every major conclave network. It was a good offer. In any other situation, it would have been an extraordinary offer. The kind of offer that ended conflicts. The kind of offer that got you remembered. Pelin Va finished. He had taken 22 minutes. He was concise for a being of his age and experience. Marchetti nodded slowly. He said, "That's a very thorough proposal." Pelin Va said, "We believe it addresses the full scope of the violation." Marchetti looked at his coffee. He said, "I understand why you think that. The losses are grievous. No one disputes this. But continued escalation benefits no one. Let the conclave process deliver justice. That is what the process exists for." Marchetti was quiet for a moment. Pelin Va was 300 years old. He had seen a great deal. He had seen species make the decision to step back from the edge. He had been the one who helped them step back, most of those times. He was very good at reading the pause before someone said yes. He had spent 3 centuries learning to extend that pause, to let it breathe, to let the person find their way to yes. He thought Marchetti was in the pause. Marchetti was not in the pause. He said, "That window is closed." He said it the way you say a thing that is not a position, not an opening bid, not a stance to be negotiated from, a description of reality. The window is closed. This is a fact about the window. The window is not open. The window will not be opened. There is no window. He stood up. He extended his hand in the human custom. And Pelin Va had been dealing with humans long enough to know what the handshake meant, what it was supposed to project. Courtesy, respect, no hard feelings. The relationship continues even if this particular discussion does not. He shook Marchetti's hand. Marchetti walked out. Pelin Va sat in the chair alone for a moment. In 300 years of diplomacy, he had heard many things said in many ways, and he had learned to hear past the words to the thing underneath. What he heard underneath Marchetti's 4 words was not anger. It was not grief exactly. It was something he didn't have a name for in his language, or any language he had learned. It was the sound of a door that had already been shut, not slammed, shut deliberately, completely. The way you shut a door when you are leaving a room you will not return to. He sent an urgent communication to the Voth hegemony. He did not recommend that they wait 2 years. The fleet hit the edge of Voth-controlled space on day 49, ahead of schedule. The analysts who had calculated 6 months had used human ships rated speed. They had not accounted for the modifications that had been running continuously since hour 1 of the mobilization. They had not accounted for the fact that Okafor had cut everything from her fleet that was not necessary for combat and forward movement. Supply protocols, comfort systems, redundancies that the regulations said were mandatory, and that she had flagged as acceptable risk and signed the waivers personally for each one. They had not accounted for the simple fact that her fleet was not traveling at recommended cruise speed. They were running, not fast. Coordinated, not panicked, not scattered. Together, in formation, at a speed that was not recommended and was not safe, and that Okafor had ordered on day 2, and that her crew had sustained without a word of complaint for 49 days. The VOTH's early warning stations saw them coming. The stations broadcast alerts. The alerts reached Kretsavroon. She looked at the timeline her analysts had given her. 6 months, they had said. She was looking at 49 days. She called her analysts back in. They ran the calculations again. They confirmed the numbers. They confirmed that the fleet was still accelerating. They confirmed that by the time it reached the perimeter of hegemony space, the Johannesburg alone would be running at a speed that should not be structurally sustainable for a human-built ship. One of the analysts, Junior, unwise in the way that junior analysts sometimes are unwise, said, "They'll have to slow down soon." The senior analyst looked at the readouts. The senior analyst said nothing. Kretsavroon dismissed them all and sat alone. Outside the window of her command ship, the stars were very steady and very old. She thought about her calculation. She thought about what she had not included in it. She tried to include it now and found that she did not have the right numbers. She did not know what number to put in the box that was labeled. Roughly, what they will accept as sufficient. She had assumed there was a number. She was beginning to think she had assumed wrong. The VOTH fleet at the Kethvar perimeter was called the Second Claw. It had 17 ships. By the standards of the Galactic Conclave, it was a medium force. Not a show of overwhelming power, not a patrol, something in between. A message, the kind of fleet you put at a border when you want someone to think carefully before crossing it. It was commanded by a vice admiral named Suvrath, who had 40 years of service and had fought in 2 actual wars and understood what a battle fleet looked like. He looked at Okafor's incoming fleet and understood what he was seeing. He broadcast on the standard challenge frequency. Identify, state intention, hold position for diplomatic contact. The human fleet did not hold position. He broadcast on the command frequency. This is contested space. Stand down and open negotiations. The human fleet did not stand down. He tried 3 more frequencies. He was methodical about it. He was a professional, and professionals used every available step before the last one. The VOTH had a doctrine for this. It was called the 7 contacts, and it was the established process for de-escalating a fleet confrontation. Contact 1 through 6 existed to find the off-ramp. Contact 7 was the off-ramp not being there. Suvrath went through contacts 1 through 6 in 20 minutes. He moved to contact 7. He opened fire. The engagement lasted 4 hours. This was the first thing the galaxy would talk about for years afterward. Not the outcome. The 4 hours. Because Suvrath's fleet hit the human formation with its first salvo, and the human formation did not break. It did not scatter. 3 ships took damage in the first 60 seconds, serious damage. Oh, the kind of damage that should have pulled them back to defensive distance to assess and regroup. They kept coming. Suvrath adjusted. He was a good commander. He reformed his line. He targeted the flagships, the communication hubs, the ships that a formation needed to function as a formation. It was correct tactical thinking. The human formation absorbed it and kept coming. By hour 2, 2 human ships were gone. Not disabled, gone. And Okafor's fleet was still accelerating into the engagement zone. Suvrath had never seen a fleet absorb losses like this without pulling back. The math said, pull back. Any rational calculation said, you are losing ships. Reconsider, find another approach. The humans were not pulling back. By hour 3, Suvrath's fleet had taken losses it had not taken in any engagement on record. He broadcast a ceasefire signal. The human fleet did not cease fire. He broadcast on the Mercy Covenant frequency. That particular frequency was only used for specific communications. Hospital vessels, humanitarian operations, the most protected class of signal in galactic law. He had never used it in a fleet action. Nobody had ever used it in a fleet action. But it was the universal frequency. Everything in space was required to monitor it. Everything in space was required to respond. He broadcast his ceasefire request on the Mercy Covenant frequency. The response came from the Johannesburg directly. It came from Okafor personally. She said, "You use that frequency to kill my people. You don't get to use it to save yours." Suvrath stared at his communication screen for a moment. Then he ordered the retreat. It was not a tactical retreat. It was not a strategic withdrawal to a better defensive position. It was a retreat, plain and honest, because his fleet had run the numbers, and the numbers said that if they stayed, there would be no fleet left. He had been a soldier for 40 years, and he had never retreated. He retreated. He sent an emergency communication to Crace Savroun. He wrote it carefully because he was a careful man who chose his words with precision. He wrote, "They don't stop." Word reached the conclave in hours. The council convened. Emergency session, the second in 3 weeks, the most consecutive emergency sessions in 112 years. The data from Suvrath's engagement logs was shared with the full council under joint review. Species who had been watching the human mobilization with concern watched the engagement logs with something more than concern. The noon military analyst, a being named Greth Koss, who had studied conflict for 2 centuries and who was not given to dramatic statements, watched the engagement log once and then watched it again. The chair of the council asked for his assessment. He said, "They don't fight to a threshold." "Explain," said the chair. "Every species we have ever encountered, every species in recorded galactic history, fights to a threshold. There is a point at which the cost of continued fighting exceeds the projected value of victory. All rational military strategy is built on this. You push until the other side reaches their threshold. They push until you reach yours. Somewhere between those 2 points is where wars end. And the humans." Greth Koss looked at the engagement log again. At the moment when 2 human ships were destroyed and the formation continued accelerating. "I cannot find their threshold," he said. "I have been looking for it. It is not in this data." The chamber was quiet. "Then we need to find it," the chair said. "Yes," Greth Koss said. He did not say what he was thinking, which was, "I am not sure it exists." 7 inhabited systems in Voth space, 4 border systems, 2 mid-territory systems, 1 deep system that held the hegemony's primary administrative center. In 11 days, 3 border systems were gone. Not destroyed, not burned to the ground, taken. Okafor's fleet moved through each one with a precision that the conclave's military observers found difficult to parse at first, because it did not look like conquest, and it did not look like occupation, and it was not quite either thing. It looked like removal. The Voth military presence was removed. The civilian populations were not touched. Not 1 civilian casualty was reported in any of the 3 systems. In the second system, when a human unit was directed to the administrative complex and found it full of civilian workers, Okafor halted that unit, directed the civilians to evacuation transport, waited 4 hours for the evacuation to complete, and then proceeded. 4 hours, while the campaign was running, while the Voth were reinforcing their next line. She waited 4 hours for civilians to clear a building. The conclave military observers wrote this into their reports and stared at it and did not know what category to put it in. It did not fit their models of how a fleet running at this speed, with this momentum, with these losses, behaved. It was not mercy. Mercy implied a choice to show it, and Okafor's pauses never looked like choices. They looked like procedure, like something built in. We don't touch civilians, not as a policy, as a physics, as something so foundational that it wasn't a decision. The Voth were not afforded the same consideration. The conclave ran new models. Previous models had said 2 years for humanity to pose a meaningful threat to the hegemony. They ran new models with the actual engagement data. They ran them 4 times. And the models said 4 months for the Voth hegemony to functionally collapse as a military power. 3 months if the human fleet maintained its current pace, which the models also noted should be impossible based on standard ship endurance ratings, but which was, in fact, happening. The council called another emergency session. Species who had no direct stake in the conflict were now very interested. The Aresi ambassador, a spider-like being named Voss Thin, who had been attending conclave sessions for 600 years and had the kind of composed authority that 6 centuries of attending things gives you, asked one question. She asked, "Is there anything we can offer them to stop?" The room considered this. Vostor of the Sun Collective, who had been very quiet in recent sessions, said, "I think that may be the wrong question." "What is the right question?" Voss then asked. Vostor said, "Whether they are doing this to win something or to finish something. Because if they are doing it to win, then yes, there is probably something we can offer. But if they are doing it to finish," she did not complete the sentence. She didn't need to. On day 7 of the campaign, the Johannesburg held a memorial. It was not announced. No communication was sent to any external party. It was an internal matter. Every ship in the fleet received the signal and went quiet. Not combat quiet, they maintained all operational readiness, but the communications that were not combat essential went still. Okafor stood in the Johannesburg's main hall. The hall was not designed for ceremonies. It was a large, multi-use space with overhead lighting too bright and floors too hard and all the warmth of a cargo bay. She hadn't asked for anything to be done with it. She stood in the middle of it. She read 847 names out loud. She read them the way she had read them in her quarters on the way here. Not performing, not projecting, just reading, just saying them, giving them the space of being said. Some of them she knew how to pronounce exactly. Some she was approximating, and she knew she was approximating. She read them anyway. She read the non-human names with the same care she gave the human ones, doing her best with the sounds. It took 2 hours and 19 minutes. Her crew stood with her for all of it. Nobody sat. Nobody made a sound. When she was done, she stood in the silence for a moment. She said, "Advance." They advanced. None of this was visible to the conclave. None of it was performed for anyone. No camera, no recording, no transmission. It existed in that hall and in the 2 hours and 19 minutes, and in the fact that every person in the fleet who had watched it on the internal feed went back to their stations immediately after. If the conclave had seen it, the analysts, the observers, the researchers, they might have understood something faster. They might have understood the difference between a fleet running on orders and a fleet running on something that was deeper than orders and could not be negotiated with. But the conclave didn't see it. The conclave saw the advance. 3 species filed emergency petitions for conclave intervention. Not supporting the Voth. That particular ship had long since sailed, and everyone knew what Kreth Savrun had done. But humanity was not stopping, and the galaxy found this very alarming in the way that watching something familiar suddenly move very wrong is alarming. You know what a river looks like. You know what it looks like when the river floods. This was something else. This was the river deciding to go somewhere. Rivers don't go, and going there, and not being interested in the banks. The 4th system held, or tried to. The Voth had reinforced it with everything they had available. 3 times the ships that had been at the perimeter. A defensive formation that the conclave observers called textbook. A position that should have cost Okafor's fleet far more than she could afford. She flanked it, and the Johannesburg split the fleet, something that was considered very high risk in standard doctrine, because a split fleet was a vulnerable fleet, and took half of it around the defensive position's northern edge, while the other half held the engagement directly. Split fleets got beaten. Everyone knew this. Okafor's split fleet did not get beaten. The 4th system fell in 31 hours. Afterwards, Suvrath, reassigned to the 4th system's defense after his perimeter retreat, sent another message to Kreth Savrun. He wrote, "This will not stop. Whatever you think you can offer, they have decided not to be offered anything. I do not know how I know this. I know it." Kreth Savrun read the message. She read it twice. She called her legal team. Not to file more diplomatic documents. Ikram. The offer of personal surrender came through the conclave's formal channels on day 9. Kreth Savrun, commanding admiral of the 3rd Splinter Fleet, offered herself, in custody, handed to human authority, answerable to whatever tribunal Earth named, in exchange for a ceasefire. It was a significant offer. In galactic law, the personal surrender of a commanding officer was the highest value step below the full capitulation of a government. It had ended conflicts before. It was understood as the ultimate personal accountability, the act that said, I did this, I know I did this, I am placing myself in your hands. The offer was transmitted to the Johannesburg at 1400 fleet time. Okafor's response arrived at 1440. 40 seconds. She said, bring her. And we're not stopping. The conclave received a copy of this exchange automatically through their monitoring systems. The room that received it was a monitoring station staffed by 3 analysts on rotating shift. Junior positions, desk work, mostly routine. The analyst who read the response read it twice. He looked at his colleague. His colleague had also read it. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then the senior of the two picked up the priority line to the council chair's office. She said, you need to see this. The chair read it. The chair called an emergency council session, the 4th emergency session in as many weeks. This one was different from the others. The previous sessions had the quality of alarm, of people trying to get ahead of events. This session had a different quality, quieter, more deliberate. The way a room goes quiet when everyone in it has just understood the same thing at the same moment. One of the Voth's allied species, the Aresi, through their ancient ambassador Voss Thin, proposed the formation of a joint intervention fleet, not to fight the humans. That particular conversation was had very briefly and was very quickly confirmed to be not a conversation anyone wanted to have. To stop them. There was a difference. At least everyone agreed that there should be. On day 11, the 5th system came under bombardment. Okafor's fleet did not stop for it. They ran simultaneous operations. The 5th system under pressure, while the 4th system was being secured, and the 6th system was already being scouted. The Voth had 7 inhabited systems. 3 were gone. The 4th was gone. And the 5th was going. Greth Koss, the conclave military analyst who had said he could not find the human's threshold, updated his models again. He put new numbers in the boxes. He sat back. At the current rate, not a projected rate, not an estimated rate, the actual rate of the actual campaign, the Voth hegemony would cease to exist as a functioning military and political entity in 31 days. He stared at 31 days for a long time, 6 months. That was what the models had said at the start. 6 months, not 31 days. He thought about what was different. What had his model not included? He had included ship count, firepower, speed, tactical capacity, supply lines, attrition rates. He had not included whatever it was that was making Okafor's fleet run past the point where his model said it would stop, when he still did not know what number to put in that box. He was beginning to think the box did not have a number. He was beginning to think that was the thing the galaxy had failed to account for. Not the ships, not the tactics. The 2 hours and 19 minutes. The thing that the Johannesburg's hall held for a morning, with no cameras, for nobody but themselves, that they then walked back from to advance. He did not know about the 2 hours and 19 minutes, but he was starting to feel the shape of them. The Joint Intervention Fleet assembled in 3 days. 9 species, 42 ships. Firepower that the galaxy had not assembled in one place since the last time everyone had agreed something needed to stop, and nobody had wanted to be the one to let it continue. It was not a war fleet. Oh, that distinction was made very carefully in the official conclave communications, and in the unofficial conversations behind closed doors, and in the careful language of the joint resolution that authorized its assembly. It was an intervention fleet. It was there to intervene. It was there to stand between two parties and allow reason to enter the space that anger was currently occupying. This is what it was called. This is what everyone agreed it was. Nobody standing in the conclave chamber when the resolution passed said out loud what everyone in the chamber understood. That 9 species had just assembled 42 ships because one species with fewer ships and older technology was 6 days away from ending an entire civilization and would not answer its messages. The Joint Intervention Fleet assembled. It moved to intercept. High Arbiter shell toss of the Nuun was 800 years old. In 800 years, he had mediated 47 interstellar conflicts. He had sat across from species that wanted each other dead, and he had found the thread. There was always a thread, he had come to believe. Always something to pull that led away from the worst outcome. He had pulled 47 threads. 47 times he had found the thing that worked. He had a reputation in the conclave. Not for brilliance. Brilliance was common. His reputation was for patience. He had the kind of patience that 800 years of practice builds, the kind that does not crack under pressure or speed up under urgency. He would find the thread. He led the Joint Intervention Fleet. He composed his broadcast to Okafor carefully. He spent 6 hours on it. He was aware that he was 800 years old, and that in 800 years he had learned how to speak to species that were angry, that were grieving, that had convinced themselves there was no other way. He knew the words that opened doors. He knew how to find the dignity in a position and speak to that dignity and let the person on the other side feel heard enough to move. He sent the broadcast. He said, "You have made your statement. The galaxy has heard it. Stand down and let the conclave finish this. The conclave will finish this. You have our word." He waited. The response came from the Johannesburg in 11 minutes. The response was not words. The response was a change in the human fleet's formation. It split. Okafor watched the joint fleet's position on the tactical screen and made the decision in about 4 seconds. It was not a difficult decision. It was a decision with a very clear logic and a very clear risk. The logic was, the joint fleet was not here to fight her, and she did not want to fight it. And if she went around it, she would signal that she could be managed by interposition, which she could not. If she went through it, she would either fight 9 species simultaneously, or she would make them choose whether they were actually prepared to fight her. She did not think they were prepared to fight her. She split the fleet. Half continued toward the 6th Voth system. The other half turned to face the joint fleet. She opened a direct channel to Sheltos. She said, "Arbiter." He said, "Admiral, I would ask you to reconsider. You have 2 choices," she said. "Move or become the second mistake made in this sector." A pause. She could hear the age of it. The kind of pause that someone who has conducted 47 negotiations uses when they are deciding which thread to pull next. He said, "Admiral, you cannot fight all of us." "I'm not planning to fight all of you," she said. "I'm planning to go through you. There is a difference. I would recommend not making me demonstrate it." Silence. She watched the tactical screen. The joint fleet had stopped moving. Her half-fleet facing them had stopped moving. She switched primary focus back to the Voth campaign. The 6th system was engaged. Updates coming through. She read them. She gave orders. She managed 2 simultaneous situations the way she had managed multiple surgical theaters. Compartmentalized, each one getting what it needed, neither one getting everything. The clock ran. 47 hours. The joint fleet held its position. Okafor's half-fleet held its position. Inside the joint fleet's command ship, Sheltos had conversations with every member species representative in rotating sessions. He was looking for the thread. He was always looking for the thread. The Noon representative said they should hold. The Soon collective said they should hold. The Aresi ambassador Voss Thin, who had come personally, said very little and watched Okafor's fleet on the scanner. At hour 30, a junior conclave officer made the observation that Okafor's facing half-fleet had not reduced readiness in 30 hours, which meant the crew was running on minimum sleep and maximum operational state, and that this should not be sustainable. Nobody responded to this observation. By hour 40, the observation had been quietly abandoned. At hour 44, Sheltos received updated data from the Voth campaign. The 6th system had fallen. 1 system remained. He read the update. He sat with it. 800 years. 47 conflicts. He had always believed that the threat existed. He still believed it. He believed it the way he believed anything foundational. Not because he could prove it in every case, but because abandoning it would require him to become something he did not want to be. But there were 47 hours of data now, and the data was the data. Okafor had not moved. Okafor was not going to move. If the joint fleet forced an engagement, people would die. Not just human people, Noon people, Soon people, Aresi people. Species who had no part in what Kreth Savrun had done would bury their own because of it. He could not find the thread. At hour 47, Sheltos gave the order. The joint fleet moved aside. Not dramatically, not with speed. The kind of movement that is trying very hard not to look like what it is. 42 ships from 9 civilizations adjusting their position in space, widening the corridor, making room for passage. A 9-species armada, stepping out of the road for one woman. Okafor watched it on the tactical screen and felt nothing she could name. Not triumph, not relief. Something below both of those, quieter. The feeling you get when something you knew would happen happens, and knowing it in advance did not make it feel like a small thing. She gave the order to her facing half fleet. They turned and rejoined the campaign. The Voth hegemony's governing body was called the Long Council. It had 11 members. It had been meeting in continuous session since the fourth system fell. It had been meeting in a state of increasing urgency that had passed through alarm and through panic and into something that did not have a name in Voth language. The state of having run every calculation and found no version of the numbers that came out in your favor. They broadcast unconditional surrender on day 14. They did not negotiate the timing. They did not request conditions. They did not ask for guarantees. Unconditional was a word with a specific meaning in galactic law, and they used it because it was the accurate word. The broadcast went to the conclave. It went to the Johannesburg. It went on open frequency. Okafor received it. She confirmed receipt. She did not stop the campaign. 3 days passed. The conclave sent urgent inquiries. The Voth sent increasingly desperate repetitions of the surrender broadcast. 3 council members personally transmitted to the Johannesburg, asking Okafor to confirm that she had received the Voth's capitulation. She confirmed each time that she had received it. She did not explain why she was continuing. On day 17, she stopped. The campaign stopped. The fleet held its positions in Voth space, 5 systems under human control, and held. Okafor opened a channel to the conclave. When she said she was ready to discuss terms, the conclave opened a formal treaty session within the hour. Every available mediator, Sheltos at the head. He had not slept more than 4 hours in 6 days, and it showed, and he was there anyway. The Voth Long Council was present. They had their legal team. They had their advisors. They had, Sheltos observed, the look of people who had come prepared to negotiate and were trying very hard to maintain the posture of it, even though they understood that this was not going to be a negotiation. Okafor sent her terms in a single document. The conclave's translation team processed it. It was not long. Okafor was not a long document person. She was a surgeon, and surgeons wrote concise notes. The terms Kreth Savrun remanded to human custody. No conclave tribunal. Human custody as human proceedings, human outcome. This was the first term, and it was not movable. The Voth hegemony to submit to a decade of conclave-monitored demilitarization. Full transparency, regular inspection, mandatory reporting. Any breach to be considered an act of aggression against Earth, which would make it an act of aggression against whatever Earth decided to do about it. Reparations. Specific, substantial reparations. Not a symbolic amount, not a diplomatic gesture. Real resources, directed to 2 places. The families of the 847 human crew of the Asclepius and the families of the 1,553 patients of 11 species who had been on board. Every family, located and compensated, a permanent memorial constructed at the exact coordinates where the Asclepius was destroyed. Funded entirely by Voth resources, maintained in perpetuity. The design to be submitted to Earth for approval. And one more thing, a new clause in galactic law, specific and short. Sheltos read it 3 times because he wanted to be sure he was reading it correctly. The clause said, any vessel registered as a medical vessel under the Mercy Covenant, flying under the flag of any conclave member species, was to be protected by automatic mutual defense obligations. Attack 1, and it was a declaration of war against Earth. No vote, no process, no window. The clause bore a name. It was called the Asclepius Covenant. Sheltos read the document. He read it again. He looked at the Voth Long Council, the Long Council's senior member, a being named Arveth, who had been in governance for 100 years and who had the kind of face that 100 years of governance produces. We was looking at the document too. This clause, Arveth said, The Asclepius Covenant, it requires full conclave ratification. We cannot agree to it unilaterally. I know, Okafor said. Then it cannot be part of these terms. The conclave, then the conclave will vote on it, Okafor said, after you sign everything else. Silence. Arveth looked at Sheltoss. Sheltoss said nothing. He was 800 years old and he was tired and he was looking at Okafor's terms and he was thinking about the clause and about what it would mean for galactic law and about the 47 hours and about the joint fleet moving aside. He said to Arveth, "Sign." Arveth said, "High Arbiter, the implications?" "I am aware of the implications," Sheltoss said. "Sign." The Long Council signed. Every term, every condition. They did not negotiate a single word. Sheltoss requested a private channel with Okafor after the signing. She granted it. He looked at her on the screen. She had been in this campaign for 17 days, and she looked like it. Tired in a way that was beyond sleep. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something very heavy for a long time and not being able to put it down. She was sitting in her command chair on the Johannesburg, and she was very still. He said, "You would truly have gone through us." It was not a question. She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He was composing the right question. In 800 years, he had learned that the right question, asked correctly, was the thing that opened doors. He said, "Why? I want to understand. Not diplomatically, not for the record. Why?" She looked at him. She was quiet for long enough that he thought the channel had issues. Then she said, "Because they went to work every day to save lives." She stopped, started again. "That's all they were doing. Amara Solis was in surgery when it happened. She was elbow deep in a patient when the alarms went off, and she finished. She finished the surgery. In 11 minutes, while her ship was being destroyed around her, she finished the surgery because that was what she was there to do." A pause. Kreth Severoon knew that. She looked at a ship full of doctors and nurses and she decided they were useful. Leverage. A calculation. She put people who went to work every day to help into a box labeled resource, and she used them. Okafor was not angry. He could see that. This was not the voice of anger. I needed the galaxy to understand that there is no math that makes that acceptable. Not to us, not ever. I needed it written somewhere permanent, in terms that don't require interpretation, so that the next time someone looks at a hospital ship and does the math. She stopped. "The math comes out different," she said. Sheltoss looked at her. 800 years. He had spoken to hundreds of leaders of hundreds of species on hundreds of occasions that mattered. He had a sense for when someone was performing and when someone was not. She was not performing. She said, "I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I could have let the conclave process handle it, that the same result could have been reached without." She gestured vaguely at the space around her that was formerly Voth-controlled. "Oh, all of this." "The thought had crossed my mind," he said. "Maybe," she said, "maybe the conclave would have reached it. In a year, 2 years, with fine print and exceptions and review periods." She looked at him steadily. "But the next admiral who looks at a hospital ship and runs the math, she needs to feel the answer before she finishes the calculation. She needs to know it in her bones, not because she read a resolution." She said, "That's what I was building." Sheltoss sat with that. 800 years. He said, "The Asclepius Covenant will pass. You know that." "Yes," she said. "You knew it when you wrote it." "Yes. You knew we would ratify it because the alternative—" He paused. "The alternative is explaining to our species that we voted against protecting hospital ships because it was procedurally complicated." "Yes," she said. He almost smiled. He said, "You are a better diplomat than you allow yourself to appear." She said, "I was a surgeon. I fixed the problem in front of me." He looked at her one more time. "Admiral," he said, "I want you to know that I am going to spend considerable time over the next few decades being very glad that you are not hostile." Something moved across her face that was not quite a smile and was not nothing. She closed the channel. The Asclepius Covenant went to full conclave vote 11 days after the treaty signing. 14 member species voted in favor immediately. The remaining 3 requested clarification on the mutual defense obligations. Our Sheltoss provided clarification. All 17 voted in favor. It was the fastest ratification of any galactic law in 400 years. The monument at Asclepius coordinates was commissioned within the month. A white ring, 40 meters wide, the width of the red cross that had been on her hull, visible from 3,000 kilometers out, the way the cross had been, the way it had always been. You could see it, and you would know. 3 years later, the galaxy was not the same, not dramatically different, not in ways you could point to from the outside and say, there, that is where it changed. It was quieter than that. More like the way a room changes after a window is opened in it. Everything looks identical, the furniture is in the same place, but something has moved through it, and it is not going back to what it was. The Asclepius Covenant had been in effect for 2 years and 11 months. In that time, 0 medical vessels had been attacked. This number sounds obvious. It sounds like the floor, like the starting point, like the thing that was always supposed to be true. But the researchers who tracked conclave conflict data understood what the number meant. In the 4,000 years before the Covenant, there had been 11 recorded attacks on medical vessels. Not many, not a pattern anyone had called a crisis, but 11 times across 4 millennia, someone had done the math and liked the answer. Nobody had done the math in 2 years and 11 months. The conclave's cultural researchers had a theory about why. No, they called it calculated deterrence in their papers and cited strategic realities and mutual defense obligations and the changed legal framework. Vast tour of the Soon Collective, who had read every paper and found them technically accurate and fundamentally incomplete, had a different word for it. She called it memory. The galaxy remembered 47 hours. The galaxy remembered a 9-species armada stepping sideways. The galaxy remembered the answer that had come back in 40 seconds when Cress of Rune offered herself in exchange for a ceasefire. Bring her. We're not stopping. The memory did work. The math came out different, not because of the paper it was written on, because of what everyone now knew lived on the other side of the calculation. Cress of Rune served her sentence at a facility in New Zealand. It was a low building set into a hillside with windows on 3 sides. The people there were professional. Correct. They ensured she had adequate food that her biology could process, adequate climate, adequate access to communication. She was not placed in a cell. She had a room with a door that locked from the outside at night and opened in the morning. She had expected something different. This was the thing she spent the most time sitting with in her first months there. She was a military mind. She understood punishment, deterrence, the use of suffering as policy. She had expected suffering. She had expected the kind of treatment that matched the size of what she had done. Something proportional, something that communicated through its harshness what the Covenant had communicated through its language. Instead, she got New Zealand and people who called her by her name and a window that faced a mountain. She asked a guard about this once. The guard was a woman in her 30s, local, who had a very direct manner, and who Creth Savrun had come to understand was approximately the opposite of someone who would be diplomatic about things if pressed. She said, "Why am I being treated this way?" The guard said, "What way?" "Humanely." The guard considered this. She said, "You killed doctors." "Yes. We're not going to become something worse than what you did just to make a point." Creth Savrun thought about this for a long time. She was still thinking about it 3 years into her sentence. She wrote a document during her 3rd year that the conclave eventually classified as supplementary philosophical material and added to their legal ethics archive. It was not a confession, it was more like an accounting, an attempt to trace the exact shape of the calculation she had made and identify where specifically the calculation had been wrong. She identified 2 errors. The first was assuming that the Mercy Covenant was a rule that operated by consensus and could therefore be tested when consensus was inconvenient. The second was harder to write. She wrote it and erased it 4 times. The second error was that she had not understood the difference between a civilization that followed rules because it was told to, and a civilization that had built its rules from something older than policy. She had looked at humanity, new to the conclave, still learning, eager and naive, and she had seen inexperience. She had not understood that the Red Cross was 40 meters wide because someone a very long time ago on a very small and violent planet, had decided that healers were protected, and that decision had survived every war since, had been carried forward through centuries of chaos, had been placed on a ship going into someone else's disaster to take care of people it didn't have to take care of. That was not naivety. She had mistaken something very old for something very young. She finished the document. She put it in the submission box that her custodians checked weekly. She looked out the window at the mountain and felt something she didn't have a precise word for. Not regret exactly. Yeah, regret was too simple and too self-focused. Something more like comprehension. The feeling of finally understanding the full dimension of a thing you had only looked at from one side. Ships made detours. This was not a formal thing. Nobody announced it. Nobody logged it as policy. But in the 3 years after the Asclepius monument was placed at coordinates in the HFY corridor, captains of ships from 14 species had added hours to their routes. Some of them significant hours, the kind of detour that required sign-off from a commanding officer who had to put a reason in the log. The reasons in the logs were things like sensor calibration in sector, or course correction for debris field mapping, or on 3 occasions when the captain apparently did not feel like being indirect about it, past memorial visit. The white ring was 40 meters across, and it floated in empty space in a part of the corridor that had been a war zone 3 years ago and was now very quiet. No territory anyone was actively contesting. The wars that had chewed through HFY had ended. Not because of humanity, though the Voth's removal from the region had simplified several things. Mainly because the species fighting them had exhausted the thing that wars run on, which is the belief that you have not yet paid enough to stop. Ships stopped near the ring. They didn't always report why. Greth Koss, the conclave military analyst who had spent weeks trying to find a threshold in Okafor's campaign data, made the detour himself in his 2nd year after the treaty. He was traveling between postings. He rerouted. He sat in the observation bay of his transport vessel and looked at the ring for about 20 minutes. He was not a sentimental being. He was an analyst. He had, over a long career, processed a very large amount of data about things that beings did to each other in conflicts, and he had done this processing with the necessary professional distance. He sat and looked at the ring. He thought about 847 names read aloud in a military hall with bright lights and hard floors for 2 hours and 19 minutes, for nobody but the people in the room. He didn't know about the 2 hours and 19 minutes. He thought about it anyway, from the shape that everything else had made. He was there for 40 minutes total. He filed the detour as navigational adjustment. Okafor retired from Fleet Command in the 2nd year. The official announcement was brief and standard, the kind of language that covers everything without saying anything. Distinguished service, long career, well-earned rest. She took a position at a new institution. It had been Shell Toss's suggestion, and she had been resistant to it, and then she had agreed because she had a habit of agreeing to things once she understood what they were actually for. The Conclave Joint Conflict Resolution Institute was a new body, created as part of the treaty architecture, funded by multiple species, charged with training mediators and conflict analysts and diplomatic practitioners in methods that could work across species lines. It was, in short, a school for people who wanted to stop wars. Okafor taught one course. It was listed in the Institute's catalog as Understanding Thresholds in Multi-Species Conflict, Theory and Application. Her first lecture drew twice the registered number. Species who had been conducting interstellar diplomacy for centuries longer than humanity had existed came to sit in a room and watch a human woman explain de-escalation. She was aware of the irony. She used it deliberately. She opened every first lecture the same way. She said, "I am a retired fleet admiral who just finished a military campaign in which I ignored multiple ceasefire offers and went through a 9-species conclave intervention force to complete my objective. If you think I am not qualified to teach you how conflicts are resolved, you are probably right, and you should stay anyway. It's because everything I'm about to tell you, I learned by doing the opposite of it first." The room was always very attentive after that. She was a good teacher. Not because she had theories, she had some, they were useful, but because she had the specific quality that the best teachers have, which is having done the thing badly before doing it correctly, and being willing to be specific about exactly how and where and why they had done it badly. She talked about the Asclepius covenant in every course, not as a victory, as a case study. She talked about what it cost. She was specific about what it cost. She put the number on the board, not just 847, all the numbers, from the first day to the last, everything the campaign had spent, and she left it there. She said, the covenant was worth it. I believe that. I believe it every day. I also believe that a version of it could have been reached through processes that would have cost less. Students asked her why she hadn't used those processes. She thought about that before answering. She said, because I was not built for the timeline. Because what happened to those people was not going to live in me as something that could wait for process. That's true. And it's also a limitation, not a strength. She looked at the number on the board. The covenant is permanent because of what it cost. I know that. I think about whether there was a version where it became permanent without that cost, and I don't know the answer. And I am going to think about it for the rest of my life. This was not what the students expected her to say. This was exactly why they kept coming back. Elon Marchetti was still ambassador. He had been offered retirement twice and had declined twice, and nobody pushed it because Marchetti was one of those people who functioned better when he had something difficult to do, and retirement would have been cruel. He was in his office at Conclave Central Station on a Tuesday morning, working through his second coffee in the third of 17 briefings, when his aide knocked. The aide said, "Sir, first contact signal." Marchetti looked up. The aide said, "New species. They reached out directly to Earth." He set down his coffee. "Where from?" "Edge of the third arm. They've been observing the conclave for 600 years, apparently. They call themselves the Arith. 600 years of observing. 600 years watching galactic civilization from a distance, and they had chosen now to announce themselves." Marchetti said, "What does their signal say?" The aide handed him the translated text. He read it. He read it again. The signal said, "Are you the ones who burned 3-star systems over doctors?" He sat with that for a moment. 600 years of observation, 600 years of watching 17 species navigate the conclave and its rules and its history and its politics. 600 years of deciding whether this was a civilization worth joining. They had sent their first message to Earth, and this was their question. He picked up his pen. He had a habit of writing things by hand first before composing the official version. He wrote the response in his personal notebook and looked at it. He crossed out the first draft, wrote another, crossed that out too. He thought about Okafor reading 847 names in a room with hard floors. He thought about Solus, steady hands, finishing surgery while her ship came apart around her. He thought about a white ring in empty space and captains who filed navigational adjustments. He wrote the final draft. He composed it officially. He sent it. "We prefer the ones who made sure it never needed to happen again." The Arith response took 4 days, long enough that Marchetti had moved on to other work, the way diplomats move on. Not forgetting, just operating on multiple timelines simultaneously. He was in a full conclave session on an unrelated agricultural treaty dispute when his personal device flagged the incoming signal. He excused himself. He read the signal in the corridor outside the session room, standing with his device, going in the way that important things often arrive, in corridors between other things, in the moments not designed for them. The Areth said, "We have been watching your species for some time. We have a question." He wrote back, "Ask it." Their response was faster this time. They were close enough to real-time communication now, the signal delay reduced to minutes. They wrote, "Are you safe to approach?" He stood in the corridor. It was a genuine question. He could feel it as a genuine question. The weight that a species carries after 600 years of observing civilizations from a distance. Deciding whether they are safe, whether they are something you can put yourself next to without becoming smaller. The question that every species asked before it crossed the line from watching to joining. Are you safe? He thought about how to answer honestly, because the honest answer was not simple. The honest answer involved what he had just said. the ones who made sure it never needed to happen again. And it also involved 3-star systems and a campaign that didn't stop, and a woman who had said, "Bring her, we're not stopping," and meant it absolutely. The honest answer was, "It depends on what you do." But that was not how you said it. He thought about Sheltos, 800 years old, sitting across from Okafor, and asking her why. He thought about what she had said. "I needed the galaxy to understand that there is no math that makes that acceptable." He knew how to say it. He wrote, "Safer than you think. As long as you understand what we consider worth protecting." He sent it. He went back into the session. Suruwam. The Arith opened formal contact 3 days later. Their first diplomatic team arrived at Conclave Central Station on a Thursday. 6 beings, silicon-based, slow-moving, with a quality of deliberateness that Marchetti found immediately appealing, in the way that unhurried things are appealing to people who have spent their lives being hurried. They had the look of a species that had taken its time about everything for a very long time and had come to think this was correct. Marchetti met them personally. Their lead diplomat was named something that translated approximately as Vast Patience, which Marchetti thought was possibly the best name he had ever encountered for a diplomat, and told them so. Vast Patience said, "It is a family name. Many generations." Marchetti said, "Oh, well, it suits the work." They spoke for 3 hours. The Aerith had questions. Many of them, it turned out. 600 years of observation produced a specific kind of question, the kind that comes from watching something from the outside and having theories that have never been tested against the actual thing. They asked about the conclave and its structure. They asked about trade frameworks. They asked about the legal architecture of the mutual defense treaties. Then Vast Patience said, "We would like to ask about the memorial." Marchetti said, "Which one?" "The White Ring, in the Kethvar corridor." Marchetti nodded. "What would you like to know?" Vast Patience was quiet for a moment, in the way that their species was quiet, not gathering thoughts he had come to understand, but allowing the thought that was already complete to arrive at the correct pace. "Edom, we have observed your species for 600 years, Vast Patience said. In that time we have observed many conflicts, many resolutions, many memorials. The memorials are usually built for the dead of the winning side. This memorial was built for..." Another pause. "Everyone?" "Yes," Marchetti said. "The 847 crew, the 1,553 patients, 11 species." "Yes." "Including species you had no formal relationship with, species who were fighting wars that did not involve you." "Yes." Vast Patience looked at him with the slow, complete attention that their species directed at things they were trying to understand entirely. "We have not seen this before," they said, "in 600 years." Marchetti thought about Solus, 31 survivors, sitting on the floor of what remained of Cargo Bay 7. He thought about Yemi clicking back at a noon patient who was in pain. He thought about what it meant to get up every morning and go to work and try to help people who didn't share your biology on a ship you had stripped of weapons in someone else's war. He said, "We have people who decided that whether someone needed help was the only relevant question, not whether they were from the same species, not whether the war was ours. Just, do they need help?" He said, "The Asclepius was full of those people. We have a lot of them." Vast Patience was very still. Then, "And the campaign, 3-star systems." "Yes." "That was also your people." "Yes." "The same people." Marchetti looked at them. He said, "We have people who decided that anyone who tries to use helpless things as leverage answers for it. And we also have a lot of those people." Another long silence. Vast Patience said, "This is what you consider worth protecting." "Yes," Marchetti said. "The idea that you can go to work every day to help and not become someone's calculation?" "Yes. That's the one we don't negotiate." Within the first month, the Aerith registered 4 hospital ships under Asclepius Covenant protections. They had not yet formally joined the conclave. The membership process had barely begun. There were committees and reviews and the kind of procedural thoroughness that a species with 600 years of patience brought to things. But the hospital ships were registered immediately. Marchetti received the notification and read it twice. He read the 4 names of the ships. He noted that 3 of them were already operational. The Arith had not waited for the paperwork to finish to send them out into space. And the fourth was in the final stages of construction. He sat with the notification for a while. Then he sent it to Okafor. No message with it, just the notification. She responded in an hour. She wrote 4 words back. That's what it was for. The stars above New Zealand were very clear on the night that Kretsavrun finished her document. She sat at the small desk in her room and looked at what she had written. The accounting, the 2 errors, the shape of the things she had not understood. She would serve her full sentence. She understood this and did not contest it. The sentence was not vindictive. It was exactly what the Covenant Tribunal had assessed, no more. She had her window with the mountain and her guards who called her by name, and her document that she would put in the box in the morning. She thought about the Asclepius, not strategically, the way she had thought about it before, differently. She thought about Solus finishing a surgery in 11 minutes while the ship came apart around her. She had thought about this many times in 3 years, and she still could not fully fit it into any frame she had. It was not something she had a category for. This woman, this doctor, had been in the middle of saving a life, and the world had ended around her, and she had kept going. Not for leverage, not for position, not because someone had calculated an outcome. Because there was a patient. That was the whole of it. Kretsavrun looked at her document. She added 1 line at the end. She wrote, "The error was not tactical. It was a failure to understand what kind of thing I was looking at." She put the document in the box. She looked at the mountain for a while. The mountain had been there for millions of years. It had the patience of things that have been through a great many events and remain. She had read about mountains these past 3 years. She had read a great deal, having the time for it. And she understood that they were not still. They moved, very slowly, grinding and shifting over ages, in a motion too slow to observe. Things that looked like they were not moving were sometimes the things that moved the most. She went to sleep. The conclave's quarterly report, 3 years after the Asclepius, included a small note in its appendix. It noted that the Mercy Covenant, within the period since the ratification of the Asclepius Covenant, had been broadcast by a record number of vessels, not just medical ships. The report noted that 3 non-medical vessels had begun broadcasting the frequency as an act of. The report used the phrase solidarity signaling, which was a new category they had created because the old categories did not cover it. Ships that had nothing to do with medicine, broadcasting the hospital frequency, not because they had to, because they wanted the universe to know where they stood. Sheltos read this appendix note on an afternoon when he had not slept enough and had too many things on his desk. He read it twice. He thought about what it meant. He thought about Okafor's face on the screen when she had said, "That's what I was building." He understood, reading the appendix note, that she had built something she had not known she was building. Not a legal framework, not a deterrent, a signal, something that moved through space at the speed of radio waves, that said, "I know what healers are worth," that said there is a number in the calculation you are not including, that said some things are not available for leverage, and had been saying it for 2 years and 11 months without stopping. 40 meters wide, visible from 3,000 kilometers out. So you could see it, and you would know.